before we begin proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within the university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. So welcome to the third of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Knowledge Seminar Series, held by the University Library in conjunction with the Office of the DVC ISSS. My name's Liz Liding, I'm from the library, and in July last year I was fortunate enough to attend the very first NCCC Cultural Competence Leadership Program retreat. There are a number of us here in the library who have now attended that, and this seminar series, I guess, is the first of our initiatives as a community of practice being part of that program. We're now halfway through our series of 6 talks this year. We've had others on history and language, astronomy, and remaining for the rest of the year we have visual art, medicine and perspectives on gender. Today we're focusing on connection to country. We had hoped to have speakers from local land councils in central New South Wales participate, however unfortunately they couldn't make it, so today has been slightly reframed from what was advertised. What we'll have is Peter and Beck, who I'll introduce properly in a moment, who will be taking us through and giving us an insight on their, I guess, cultural competence journey through their working on country and working with community, as well as taking us through some of their research and practical projects around integrating traditional land and environmental management principles into contemporary practice. And there will be some audience participation at the beginning. So, as to our wonderful speakers today, we have Dr Peter Ampt, who is an interdisciplinary researcher within the Sydney Institute of Agriculture. He applies participatory, mixed method approaches to improve our understanding of complex, adaptive, socio-ecological systems and works with Indigenous communities to develop working knowledge that integrates traditional knowledge of land and food with other approaches. Peter has a high profile in natural resource management with extensive contacts and experience with the land care movement, local land services, kangaroo management, which sounds fabulously fun, and ecological agriculture. He's joined by Dr Rebecca Cross, who is a postdoctoral researcher here in the School of Life and Environmental Sciences. She completed her PhD in 2015 over at UNSW, but we don't hold that against her, which examined the socio-cultural and psychological dimensions of sustainable broadacre farming transformations. Her research interests are founded in rural geography and sociology, with a focus on natural resource management, sustainable agriculture, farming subcultures and extension. Rebecca has been involved in the Landcare New South Wales-led project Communities in Landscapes, was a primary researcher on the UNSW-led Cotton Histography project for the Cotton CRC, and was recently involved in 2 projects on mining and biodiversity offsets in agricultural landscapes in Mudgee, New South Wales and the Burdekin in Queensland. So I'll hand over to Peter to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liz, and thanks everyone for coming along. I can see a lot of familiar faces from NCCC and other activities around the place, so it's great to have you with us this morning. I'd like to, whoops, I'm going to have to use that. So today, during our 2 hours together, followed by a light lunch, I'd like to cover a couple of things. So the connection to country is a component of culture, connection to country for Indigenous people, and then take you through what it means to be an Indigenous person on country in New South Wales through various government and non-government agencies such as the local Aboriginal land councils and the local land services. And Beck will talk you through a project we did for the Central Tablelands local land services, which was about an evaluation of their Indigenous engagement practices. And so that involved them us working closely with the local Aboriginal land councils in a number of places. Then I'd like to visit the Uluru Statement from the Heart and then think about what that means for us as university researchers and teachers, and what that might mean in terms of our engagement with Indigenous development in the coming years. Then we've got a question and forum that Liz will facilitate so that we get a chance to talk through a lot of these issues. So I hope that's broadly what you expected. What we had hoped, as Liz said, was that some of the representatives of the local Aboriginal land councils that we worked with in our project on engagement would have been able to be here. The key people couldn't get permission from their organisations, which is interesting, and other key people were difficult to contact. So our best intentions were to have a group of 3 or 4 people here to help make this live a little bit for you. In the absence of that, we will try and make it live for you anyway. That looks very blank. Okay, so the first thing, this is part of, I guess, our cultural competency journey. Beck and I have had a fairly rigorous cultural competency journey through both our own exposure to agriculture, but also our exposure to Indigenous communities and how they interact with farmers in the production landscape. For you, of course, you're all aware of the process of cultural competency starts with a self-reflection. And so really trying to understand that, that awakening of your own understanding of your own worldview, and then an appreciation of how that worldview might be different for other people, and about culture. And cultural competency starts with that self-reflection. So we're actually going to start with Liz's, Beck's and my self-reflection about what country actually means to us. So this is just some of the cultural competency stuff that I'm sure you're all familiar with. So in the science faculty, Beck and I started this journey in the agriculture faculty, which doesn't exist anymore. We're continuing this journey with the science faculty, and I guess what we're really interested in is what we can bring to the integration of Western science with Indigenous knowledge, and this is one of the key things that drives us in our work with Indigenous communities. And so that brings you face to face with, well, I feel a connection to country. How is my connection to country? How does it compare, if you like, to Indigenous people's connection to country? How does that fit for people who have had they've been stolen from their country and from their families? How does that work for them? And so we're looking at all of those sorts of aspects. But in order to kick this off, what we'd like to do is explore our connection to place as a group. Before we do this, we're going to spend a little bit of time both with Liz, with Beck, and then with myself, talking about what we feel is our connection to country, and then we're going to ask you to do the same thing. So I'm going to hand over now to Liz first of all, because part of the reason why we focused on Central West will become apparent when Liz talks to you.
So when Peter said he wanted me to do this, I kind of panicked a little bit, but we'll see how it goes. So one of my lasting memories from going on the retreat last year was on the final night. We were having a kind of a camp fire, I guess, down on the beach with the group from Red Bay that we'd spent a few days with, and the young men, did a wonderful performance for us, and it was quite moving. And then I was talking to Uncle Paul afterwards, and it was the first time I'd really had a one-on-one chat with him. And he said, "So where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Sydney." And he looked at me and he said, "No, where are you really from?" And I thought, "Oh." And I said, "Oh, well, I grew up in a little town called Wallerawang." Anybody heard of it? Yeah. So Wallerawang is this tiny little spot on the map, sort of halfway between Lithgow and Bathurst, if you were heading out that way, or you might have gone past it if you were on your way to Mudgee. Really the only thing there is an enormous coal-fired power station, which I saw every day of my life out my kitchen window. So when Joe Hockey a few years ago made the statement about wind farms I was like, really? Seeing that every day. So Wallerawang is an Aboriginal word. I was always told it meant place of wood and water. The Cox's River originally was quite a force of nature going through there, but then it was dammed for the purposes of the power station. So now it's more of a trickle. So I grew up there. I lived there until I was about 18 when I went to Bathurst for uni. So I went a really long way before then coming to Sydney in about 2000. So I've lived in Sydney now almost longer than I lived back home, but I still catch myself saying, "Oh, I'm going home to where my mother still lives." I don't have any other family there anymore, just my mum. But growing up, I guess I always didn't quite feel like I fit in there. It's a very typical kind of small town. Everybody knows your business. Everybody knows everything about everyone else. Not a whole lot to do there as a young person, so I was always desperate to get away and get to the city. which I eventually did. But yeah, there is still a part of me that sees that as home. And even now that I have a daughter, it's really important that I take her back there and I show her where I came from and where I grew up, and how it's very different to where she's growing up now in the northern suburbs of Sydney. So yes, it was really exciting when we were talking about this session and we were going to have somebody from the Lithgow community, because growing up there, there was very little that we knew about Aboriginal history of that area. It wasn't something that was spoken about, it wasn't something that was taught to us in schools. To my shame, at that barbecue, when Uncle Paul said, "Where are you really from?" and I told him, and he said, "Oh, Windradine country." And I had heard of Windradine, but more in the context of it being a housing estate on the outskirts of Bathurst. Not that it was this, amazing leader of the resistance in the Bathurst Wars, which there's been a little bit of news about lately. But yeah, a lot of very bloody frontier war type situation that, again, completely oblivious to growing up, which is just not right at all. And I've tried to address that now. So I don't know where I'm going with that, or if that helps, or if that's the kind of thing that you... so yeah, I guess I have, I have a sense of that still being home, but Sydney is still very much home now. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, so my own connection to country. So I was born and raised in Sydney and don't really feel any connection to Sydney at all. My family have always had a dairy farm in Hannam Vale, which is halfway between Taree and Port Macquarie. And that's where we always spent every holiday. Thanks. That's where we spent every holiday, and all the family stories belong on our property there. That person was birthed on the floorboards of that house, and people are buried, under the old milking shed that used to be over there. And so I've always seen it through settler eyes. All the stories are, the bullocks pulling logs out, the old tramway there. So I always saw it through those eyes. And it wasn't until I got older that I even recognised that it was Biripi country. And you start seeing it very differently. You start thinking about your ancestors very differently. And currently I'm in this weird place of I have a connection to that country, but am I allowed to? And what happens when that property comes into my hands? I then have a responsibility to probably connect with the Biripi. So that's kind of my connection to country.
Thanks, Liz and Beck. For me, I've got a few more years under my belt than you two. I guess I'd have to say that there are a number of places where I feel connected. My birthplace is the far south coast, Pambula. And we had a house there that we used to visit a lot, so there's a connection there. There's a very strong connection also in Cooma, where I grew up. My dad was an engineer on the Snowy Mountains scheme, which was a nation-building project which diverted water from the Snowy River inland to form the Murrumbidgee irrigation area, and also generated hydroelectricity, which is now part of our National Energy Plan. And I guess when I go back to that period of time, I can see that there are some very significant... I was a townie, I wasn't on a property, but my first experience of I guess, rural land ownership was working. My first ever paid job was a farmhand for one of the Litchfield family. Now, Litchfield is a very famous name in Cooma. They were early squatters in the area, and they've got large areas of land across the Monero, and they're part of the rural aristocracy, if you like. So I never met any of their kids going to the local high school. They all went away to Sydney. But my strong experience is the Litchfield elder that I was working with and his permanent farmhand, who was a part Indigenous man. And I think that might have been the first time I even recognised that there were Aboriginal people living in that area, growing up as I did, as part of that community, but not the visibility of Indigenous people wasn't there. But then the interaction between these two was fascinating for me, and that's led me into a journey which has got to do with rural land management and the social side of that and the cultural side of that. More recently, I suppose my connection to country has come through my work, and that has been the Communities and Landscapes project, which which focused on the box gum grassy woodland country, which is basically spreads from southeast Queensland all the way down to Victoria. And it's the sort of country that was first grazed by sheep. When they crossed the Blue Mountains, the sheep spread out across this country because it was open, it was fertile, it has had abundant grasslands, and I've engaged with this community and subsequently bought a property in Mudgee, which is in this community, this ecological community as well. So now I'm reconnecting to a new place, and I guess part of that is my heritage in the Monero is gone, my mum has passed away, and so I was looking to re-establish a place to belong where all my kids and grandkids can come back and be together in a place that's connected to rural Australia and ecological Australia. So I guess that's where I'm looking. Now, only recently have I really come in contact with, at any depth, Indigenous attachment to country. And that's really what I wanted to try and delve into in this workshop with you today. So now's the time for you guys to do a bit of what Liz and Beck and I have done and spend just a couple of minutes thinking about where do you belong, where's a place where you feel that you're strongly attached to. And so a couple of minutes of quiet reflection for that. And then what I'd like you to do is join together with 4 or 5 people that are sitting close to you, turn around and have a few moments of discussion with those people. And I'd like you to come up with a little bit of a statement, pick a spokesperson, come up with a little bit of a statement about what's the diversity of attachment to place that you have in your group, and what's one generalisation that you could offer about that attachment to place, okay? So now spend some time thinking yourself, just a couple of minutes, and then I'll ask you to come together with the people sitting close to you, okay? Right, so if you want to move to where you're close to people now, and then it'll be easy for you to get started talking to them. Thank you. Everybody, Beck and Liz and I did a little bit of the same activity, and I think our diversity was that just one of us, Beck, had several generations of connection through her family's ownership and living in the North Coast around Taree. And for her, the connection wasn't very movable. That was pretty set that that's the main connection point. For Liz and I, neither of our parents were born in the place where we feel connected to. And so perhaps our ability or our connection is not as deep and it's more flexible. What I didn't mention is I've lived most of my life really in the east suburbs of Sydney, and the beaches and the ocean and all of those sort of things are incredibly important to me. So I would find it hard to leave that as well. And yet, because I'm from a rural area, I kind of think of that not real, but the rural is real, but obviously that's not the case for everybody. So I think there's some interesting, and then as a generalisation, that we have varying degrees of connection, but that we all believe that a connection is important and that we want a connection with a place. I'd like to see what you guys thought of. So maybe I can start with this group here, and we've got a microphone so that it gets picked up on the recording.
We didn't really get to go around our group because we're very good talkers, but we all are people who were born outside of Australia. We've got one person from Poland, US, UK and New Zealand. And so also thinking about the thing of if you're born in a small city where you're close to the bush, and how getting out and getting to know the trees and the smells and the fields in the US, and then moving to Sydney and not sort of having that same connection because it actually is different. And then really we didn't get that much further, but I know that if we had had more time, there would have been some very interesting stories that would have come out. And so this is fun, it's great, thank you.
Please continue the discussion after.
We will.
Yeah.
We're having lunch.
Oh, good. Okay, yep, next group.
What can I say? We had 3 people from rural areas of Australia, and, well, one who was born in Sydney but spent a lot of time on the North Coast, and one from India. And so we really, by the time we shared those stories, we sort of didn't come to any great conclusions, except that we all felt a connection with somewhere.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
I think we had a lot of similarities. So we had sort of family members that were from rural New South Wales, and I suppose it's interesting the point that we sort of found in terms of our commonality was that sort of our connection to those areas was through our families. So so either having people who were living, like family members living out in country, or memories of certain places being spoken through other family members, and that. So we found that was sort of an interesting point there. Was there anything else that we wanted to add to that, or? But definitely, the connection to family was the main point that we sort of came to. And I suppose the other interesting thing was sort of losing connections as well. So sort of family members moving away from that place as well. And I think a few people raised that worry was that, well, what about that connection there? And if family moving away from there, do we start losing that connection? Or if we have memories of that, does that replace that? So,
Right.
And I think that's something. If we had more than 5 minutes, we'd probably talk about it a bit more further. But,
Okay.
but I thought that was sort of an interesting point there as well.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
All right, so we had a diverse group as well, like people from overseas, but also people from here, from Australia. So it's I think it was good to hear that. I guess our diversity level comes to terms into bringing whatever we come from, and I guess the connection to country is where we lived in, and also different areas. So we all seem to be like, mostly we moved around places, but the connection is where you mostly grew up with and the people you had connections with.
Okay.
You can see we're a group of 4, and we're all born in Australia, but our connections are, well, some of them are predictable and one's way out, okay? So two that are quite predictable are people who spent early childhood holidays having a wonderful time with family, not necessarily in the home, but away in a location. One was in the country and one was at the seaside. So one of us feels really happy and calm when near the seaside. It brings back those lovely feelings of security and happiness. And for another one, it's the country, where my family had a property, and I didn't grow up there, but we went there for holidays, and it became so much part of me that I still work in agriculture today. And another one of it was born and has strong connections to the home where she was born. Her mother was the architect who designed the home. It was a large family, and this one was actually born in the house and always knew where she was born and where the other siblings were when she was born and in her early days. And she was in that home right through her school life. So a very strong connection there. Okay, now I'll tell you the way out one. The way out one is my husband, who was born in Australia and grew up in Byron Bay, lovely place, went to primary school, didn't wear shoes, had a lovely time in the surf for years and years. No, he feels at home in Connemara in Ireland, and he hadn't been there until he was 30, 34. Is that what you said?
No, a bit more.
Oh, a bit more than 30, okay. All right, he's a bit more than 30. He hadn't been there until then, but once he was there, he felt really at home. He was coaching rugby there in a nearby town, and he would often go for long walks through the hills around Connemara. The marshes, or we call them wetlands. What do they call them? Bogs. Bogs. Yeah, they call them bogs. So he would go for long walks through the bogs and the mountains, and he felt it was part of his soul. So I don't know how you explain that one.
Thank you very much. And we've got one or two more groups.
So we have quite a diverse range of perspectives within our group. One person discussed the concepts of ownership, being on country and thinking about the trees that were on that country and reflecting on the fact that for a moment in time they felt ownership of those trees, and they were quite majestic, beautiful trees, but then reflecting on that and thinking, well, my ownership is quite transient in nature, and that those trees have been there for quite a long time, and there will be someone else who can come along and enjoy that connection with country and the trees. We also spoke about the significance of family being connected to country, and whether or not it was family being in that place that made that connection, or whether it was the country where. So I'm not articulating that very well. Yeah, I think it's more about, by coincidence, family is connected to that country, but you can still return to that place even though family is not there anymore and still feel connection. That's a better way of putting it. We also spoke about the difficulty, given some of us have moved around quite a bit, knowing what our connection to country is, given that we move across many different landscapes, and that for some of us, time spent, even though it may not be our traditional country, time spent in a new place, the longevity of that connection actually makes it feel like home.
Thank you. And we've got one more.
We also talked. We shared many of the similar stories I've heard and many of the points that other group spokespeople have made. We also talked about family, and we all had very different sort of stories, but there was a point about possibly it's a movable feast where you feel a connection to country, and even today you can be forming new connections and new memories and significances. So I think that's something we talked about. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for sharing that. I think what I'd like to move on now to is the time context of Indigenous connection to country, and put that in the frame with what we've discussed already. So I'd like to spend a bit of time just talking about the science behind when people came to Australia and what some of the science tells us about that settlement of Australia by Indigenous people. I'd like to acknowledge, of course, that traditional views on this is that people have always been there and are part of the land and will always be and always have been. So science is a little bit in conflict with that, which is always one of the interesting things about being in a science faculty and working on understanding Indigenous ways of knowing. So just from a global perspective, humans originated in the Rift Valley of Africa, according to the best available information, around 4 million years ago. There were several migrations of people out of Africa, and anatomically modern humans, so that's a bit of a collection of pre-modern skulls. The one on the far right is an anatomically modern human, and so paleontologists can very easily see whether a human skull is anatomically modern or one of the archaic forms. So these anatomically modern humans moved out of Africa somewhere before 200,000 years ago and arrived in Australia at least 50,000 years ago. And that gives you a bit of an idea of how that spread happened. Now, there was certainly spreading of humans, earlier human species before that, and some of the debate around human origins is to do with whether those earlier species of humans that became regionalised then interbred with anatomically modern humans or not. So there's all sorts of debates about that. But interestingly, from that map, you can see that from the best available evidence, people were definitely in Australia at least 50,000 years ago. And then this really interesting Nature article from last year is all about looking at the mitochondrial DNA. So we've all got mitochondria in our cells, and those mitochondria, the DNA is only maternal in origin. So unlike all of our other cells, the DNA is both a combination of our mothers and our fathers, but our mitochondrial DNA is only female. And so looking at mitochondrial DNA gives you a much more uniform and a clearer picture of lineage. And so by analysis of present-day Indigenous peoples' mitochondrial DNA, these estimates have been made about where people have colonised different parts of Australia. So you can see that, was this working? On. You can see that from arriving here somewhere around 50,000 years ago, there was movement into the islands of PNG. This, by the way, was the shoreline of about 50,000 years ago. And there was a lake in here, Lake Carpentaria in here. But people then moved around the coastline of Australia and then moved into the centre of Australia. And you can see by these numbers, individual mitochondrial DNA specimens indicated that people were in these places that long ago. And so you can see that from the early arrival, the spread happened very early on in those millennia, and that the other thing that came out of this research very strongly is that local people remained localised in those areas. And so we're talking about 4,500 years at least, 40 to 45,000 years ago at least, of people interacting in the same regional area of country. Now we know that there were song lines that passed through multiple different countries, and that the male line did a lot of that moving back and forth way beyond neighbouring groups, but the maternal remained relatively sedentary within a home range, a home area plus a number of neighbouring areas where there were direct marriage relationships and interactions between neighbouring groups. So as you'd be aware, most traditional Indigenous people would know their own language, plus they would know several other languages from the neighbouring groups around them. And so there was a lot of movement locally, but what this research suggests is that people remained very regionalised. And so we are talking about generations of people on the same land for 40,000, 45,000 years. So that's, I guess, the regional story. And so what greeted European settlers, and this is all information from the Dark Emu book by Bruce Pascoe and lots of other sources. So what greeted European explorers when they came 200 or so years ago is a whole range of different examples of technology that had been developed over many, many years, involving a lot of knowledge and a lot of understanding, which is Indigenous science. So, for example, the fisheries, and Brewarrina's fishery is probably the most famous, but there are 179 documented fishery sites around the coast and the inland of Australia, where Indigenous people essentially did a form of aquaculture, predominantly to have plenty of fish available for large festivals, but also for ongoing nutrition through the year as they move back and forth between different places. So clear understanding of fish behaviour, of fish ecology, of how much they could take without affecting the ongoing sustainability of the population. So in terms of ecology, a very sophisticated understanding of how to do that. The other is this whole debate about whether Indigenous people, the image that we've all grown up with as white Australians, is of a wandering culture without too much technology, whereas in fact the yam daisy, which was a staple for areas around here, and the better watered areas. There were large fields of yam daisies which were managed, they were transported, they were planted, they were selected, they were cultivated, and in the right place in the environment where they would survive, and they were looked after for many, many thousands of years. The next one is, which is the one that I'm very interested in, is the idea of Indigenous people using grasses. So the vast majority of Australia was covered by grasslands. That changed obviously over Australia's journey from Gondwana to its present point, but grasslands have always been a very dominant part of the Australian landscape, and Indigenous people had a very sophisticated knowledge and understanding of those grasses. They did cultivation, they did selection, they did planting, they did irrigation of those grasses. They collected them, they stored them in stone granaries. They ground them from 30,000 years ago, which is equivalent to the earliest production of flour anywhere in the world. And the seeds were traded, sown, irrigated, etc. And there were also a whole bunch of settlements around. This is well documented that these settlements had quite permanent components to their structure, as well as portable components to their structure. So essentially what we've also got the well documented multiple uses of fire by Indigenous people, the idea of fire stick farming, what it actually means, and essentially it's not just about flushing out some animals so that you can harvest them, but it was a systematic, patterned approach to managing landscape using fire as a tool. And so they kept, for example, dense forests off certain areas, so on the margins of dense forests they burnt so that there was area of green picked for a range of different animals. They managed trees so that they could be, and landscape for a range of things. And one of the things that came out of that is the idea that this is what we're looking at here is an old tree, a very ancient tree, probably about 400 or 500 years old, in the midst of young trees. And what that shows you is that those individual young trees, if they are in competition with each other, grow straight. But if a tree is growing in an area that's open, it grows in a spreading habit like the dead tree you can see in the middle of the slide. And so what this is being used, for example, by Bill Gamage in his book The Great Estate, is used as evidence that Indigenous people managed a landscape to maintain a grassland cover with scattered large trees, and that meant that those trees had a different habit to trees that are growing up without any management. So there's a whole range of different aspects of that. So that would have been done by fire largely. And there's a lot of quotes that we've got here. Patterns of burning mean that certain areas are burnt at different times. This is important to the food chain. Smoke brings on flowering. For example, areas that are burnt early provide early hunting and foraging for both man and animal life. We follow the burns, for example, with the fruiting of, for instance, apple trees and plum trees. That's native apples and native plums. Those that have been burnt earlier, their fruiting comes on earlier, etc. So you can see there's a sophisticated knowledge with the use of burning about the nature of plants, how they flower, how they produce fruit, and therefore how you can have a reliable food source over time. So all of this stuff means that the myths about Aboriginal land management that were perpetuated in the early years of colonisation and that were perhaps part of the idea that this is terra nullius, it's an unoccupied land, the evidence of a sophisticated knowledge and understanding of the natural environment and the way the land works was systematically ignored. And so we've now got good literature coming out that's suggesting that this was a cultural landscape that European people came onto 200 or so years ago. It wasn't a wilderness, it was a cultural landscape. It was a managed landscape, and it was used by the people that were there. But demonstrably a sustainably managed landscape because of the longevity of the time people had spent there. So what awaited Europeans? A lot of the areas where I'm now connected to, the Boxcombe grassy woodlands, were viewed as like an English park, with large stately trees, verdant grasslands underneath, clear streams with plenty of fish in them, the sort of thing that a nobleman would like in their estate back home. So that gives you a bit of an idea of what that's like. So of course, I'm not going to dwell on what Europeans did in the early years of colonisation. That's for another day. But what it does tell us in our interaction with the science faculty is that there's clearly a lot of science in what Indigenous people were doing on this landscape. It's been born over a large number of times. That learning was in context. It was multi-layered with multiple generations involved. That learning is remarkably stable over a long period of time. And that stability is at least through 10,000 years. So that stability is about stories repeated in context with multiple generations, subject to vigorous scrutiny and debate, communities around coastal Australia, so a remarkable consistent knowledge of rising sea levels of 8 to 10,000 years ago. So we've got a knowledge system that science would try to emulate, really, standing on the shoulders of others and understanding that, subject to peer review and building up a knowledge that's very usable and that's in tune with the environment. So that's the sort of thing that we're talking about. Now, so then to bring that into the context of what does connection to country mean to, or did it mean, and does it mean to Indigenous Australians that are still connected to their original country and that still have a connection to the knowledge systems about that original country. Unfortunately, I haven't got the audio system to work from my computer to here, but what I wanted to show you was a couple of the links here. I'll share these links with you. There's a link, there's a number of good websites that explain what connection to country means to Indigenous people. I don't want to represent that. I'm not the right person to do that. But some of the quotes are, "In the learning born of country is the light that nourishes the world. The land is my backbone. I only stand straight, happy, proud, and not ashamed about my colour because I still have land. I think of land as the history of my nation. If you belong there, your country will find a way to call you back. Country needs to be remembered, needs to be listened to, needs to know that we can still speak its language." So this is some examples. Our identity of human beings remains tied to our land, to our cultural practices, our systems of authority and social control, our intellectual traditions, our concepts of spirituality, and our system of resource ownership and exchange. Destroy this relationship and you damage sometimes irrevocably individual human beings and their health. And so, and there's a very moving piece from William Tillmouth from the Uluru Statement from the Heart from the Uluru Conference, talking about him being a successful Indigenous person with a command of English, working very well with Indigenous communities, but as a stolen generations person, having been separated from his place, and as a result feeling severely deficient as a result of that. So these are some of the realities of Indigenous people's traditional connection to country, but then the contemporary reality if they haven't been fortunate enough to remain in continuity with their place. So this brings us, of course, to the typical story. You know, the Terra Nullius Indigenous estate of 1788 was the entire continent, of 1966 was none of the continent at all. And then over successive years of more enlightened government leadership, we have a lot more areas of Australia that are now under some form of Indigenous land tenure. And to show this graphically, with one being Australia, two being Indigenous held land, 3 and 4 being the National Reserve System and Indigenous protected areas, and then there's jointly managed and cooperatively managed areas. So all of those 2 through to 6 consist of something in the order of 25 to 30% of the Australian landmass is now back under some form of Indigenous land tenure. But that land tenure is very complex. So if you look at this diagram, you can see that there are 3 different legal precedents that recreated Indigenous ownership, if you like, of land and where they happen. So you can see where they're centred in Central Australia and in Northern Australia. And if you look at New South Wales, you see very little at all. Okay, and this is a legacy of it being the earliest area settled by Europeans, the area that was exploited by agriculture very early on, and the area where the diseases such as smallpox and all of those others and the systematic genocide, if you like, happened very early on and has been happening for a longer time. So that brings us to where we, whoops, that's a very slow slide. This brings us to the New South Wales context, and where Beck and I have done a lot of our work in Indigenous communities. So the New South Wales landscape is divided up into different local Aboriginal land councils. So these were created in 1983 with the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, and so a local Aboriginal land corporation council was created in lots of different areas, and you can see they're divided into zones: the western, northwestern, central, northern, Sydney, Newcastle, South Coast, and Wiradjuri. The Wiradjuri is the only one that has an Indigenous connection, direct connection, because the Wiradjuri was the biggest of the nations in terms of geography, and so that is one local Aboriginal Land Council region. So we worked in the Central Tablelands, which is the area in the box that you can see, and as far as the way land is managed in New South Wales, it was until 2013 under the catchment management authorities, and so each of those catchment management authorities had an area of land, and you can see where those catchment management authorities were. In 2013, you can see in the area that we're working in the Central Tablelands that there were that it was part of 4 different catchment management authority areas. We've now changed that. In 2013, we created local land service regions, and so now the Central Tablelands is largely in one region for the purposes of natural resource management. So that's to do with managing land, water and biodiversity and communities, and also biosecurity, so looking after weeds and pest animals and all of that sort of thing. So that's what the local land services do. That's the segue through to Beck's work. So you can see there that we focused on 4 local Aboriginal land councils, or 3 local Aboriginal land councils, and 1 group that isn't part of a local Aboriginal land council, Mudgee, Orange, Bathurst and Lithgow. Lithgow belongs to the Bathurst local Aboriginal land council, but the community in Lithgow sees themselves as separate from the Bathurst. And so the extent to which a local Aboriginal land council is representative of the areas is very variable across different local Aboriginal land councils. And so there are some where the traditional people of the area are strongly recognised. There's other local Aboriginal land councils where that might not be the case, so that there might be, in any local area, there would be Indigenous people that were traditional to that area, but there would also be groups of Aboriginal people that were shifted to that area at various points during the colonisation process. And so all of those Indigenous people are living in that town or that area, but they have different authority to speak on behalf of the land. And so that's the sort of environment that we sit in. And the local Aboriginal land councils are the recognised body for government agencies to work through. And so they are designed to be the representative body for local Aboriginal people. And so when we were approached by the Central Tablelands Local Land Services to do an evaluation of their engagement with Indigenous communities, our first point of call had to be the local Aboriginal land councils. And so at that point, I'm going to hand over to Beck.
So I'm just going to take you through the research project that we did. And so I've packed my presentation with lots of quotes from community members from local Aboriginal land councils. because we couldn't get people here today to be able to talk to you, so I'm going to try and get as many of their words across as possible. So basically, as Peter said, we're engaged by the Central Tablelands Local Land Services to evaluate their engagement with the local Aboriginal land councils. And there are a number of people on this project that I'd just like to acknowledge there. I'd also like to acknowledge that so the University of Sydney and the Central Tablelands Local Land Services acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional owners residing within the study region. So I just take this opportunity to pay respect to past, present and emerging future elders. So in the Central Tablelands Local Land Services area, there are approximately 7,000 Aboriginal residents, which is about 4.5% of the population. So the local land services local strategic plan contains 3 relevant priorities that are directly connected to working with local Aboriginal land councils. These are the first, Aboriginal people with improved capacity to share their own cultural heritage with other Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people with stronger connections to traditional land management and cultural practices, and improvements in traditional land management practices being recognised and incorporated into modern management. So to do this, they had 3 sort of different avenues with which they're engaging with the Lauks. So the first one is protecting Aboriginal places, and I'll show you some examples of that as we go on. A cultural land management package, again, I'll talk about that later. And the other avenue was through biodiversity projects. So the aims of our study were not just to evaluate the engagement. We thought, of course, you have to take the opportunity to profile the characteristics, networks, capacity, barriers, aspirations and opportunities for Lauks. To understand the extent of engagement in the Central Tablelands LLS programs and the value of this engagement, how well it was valued by community members. And then to provide recommendations to the LLS for improving their engagement. So as Peter pointed out, so the Lauks that we were working with were Orange, Bathurst and Mudgee Lauk. And the Mingan Wiradjuri Aboriginal Corporation is the group of women that are in Lithgow that manage a lot of the significant sites around Lithgow. But they don't have the same power because they're not a Lauk themselves, but they do have some power through being a subgroup to Bathurst, but at the same time they're in very different locations. So I'm just going to go through each of the Lauks and give you a little profile of how they're operating and what sort of challenges and aspirations they have. Each Lauk is really different with how it's set up and how they run. So Orange Lauk was established in 1979. It's one of the earliest Lauks. They employ 35 people, so it's quite a large Lauk with a lot of capacity. And their main income is through Ability Links, which is a disability service, and as well as managing a refuge and a hotel. Their main property is Balanda, and it's the one that they've put the most investment in. So they got a $2.26 million grant, federal grant, over 5 years from 2013 to 2018 to rehabilitate and regenerate that piece of land. So that's quite, in comparison to the other Lauks, that's a massive investment that they've been able to put on the ground. This is the location. So I forgot to mention, for most of our focus groups that we did with the different Lauks, we had about 10 people at each focus group, and we conducted the focus group wherever we were able to, and in this case we did it on Balanda around a campfire. And there were formal and informal aspects to the focus group, and we always had a lunch so that we could discuss things off the record. So something that really characterises the Orange community, and therefore the Orange Lauk, is the fact that Orange was a large resettlement area. So from 1972 to 1986, the Community Resettlement Scheme purposely moved people to Orange and Dubbo. And this is just a quote from one of the Lauk members. So it's a resettlement zone. There's 3 towns on the highway that the government has used at different times to meet their needs. Like when the Olympics are on, they resettled people in Dubbo, Orange. So you've got different nations that are here and they're trying to get everyone together again, but it isn't always so easy. But other Lauk members mention that because there's so many different people with so many different backgrounds, in some ways that diversity makes it easier to come to negotiations. So it was playing out in both ways. One of their key achievements had been the development of the Gambu Wanana Nurambang group, which now do local land management and site rehabilitation. This group dramatically increased their capacity through LLS engagement, especially through the LLS sending the group up to Cape York to relearn traditional fire management and coal burning. So this group now does that as a fee-for-service type, like that's their main income, but they're only just starting up that business. So their aspirations are to grow that group and to heal country through traditional knowledge on not only public land but also private lands, and to have that as a paid-for service. They really want to develop enterprise as well as community connection to Balanda. So they've got all sorts of ideas for planting native grasses, especially for their weaving group, for native grass seed collection. They want a nursery for seedlings, they want signage, a walking track, and they want to be able to connect more women and youth to regenerating new women's sites and new men's sites on their piece of land that they now have. And they also want to be able to have work for the dole schemes centred around their property so that people can work on country as part of work for the dole. They've had small instances of that, but they would like that to be a very regular and full-time sort of thing. And this is just a quote from one of the elders. There are 4 elements that are important to Aboriginal people: land, wind, fire, water. Those elements are very important to our souls, to our spirit, keeps us alive. Just coming out here keeps us alive. So we've got to get back onto this country and the community can be embraced through this. So it was all about getting more activity and more people coming out to that piece of land. One of their other aspirations was repatriation of Aboriginal artefacts, in this case specifically bones that were in certain museums in the area. So some of the barriers that this Lauk was facing, number 1 was losing key people in the LLS who the group had developed trust with over time. Their reliance on funding, so this was a big push for wanting that enterprise development because so much of what they can do is constrained by funding. So we can't depend on funding forever, you've got to be sustainable, but to get to this stage takes a fair bit of work. The next quote, I guess the biggest stumbling block for all of us is the capital. We've got the land, we have the expertise, we've got guys in the community who have been trained up in that and could slip into those roles, but it's creating the opportunity for that. And that was their biggest aim, that to have a sustainable, they wanted to have enterprise so that they could grow their organisation so that it could take on more full-time workers. They wanted to be able to give people jobs, full-time jobs, not 3 months or 6 months or whatever. They need real jobs to sink their teeth into, do some training, better themselves. From where I see it, we need to get this program back on the road. So that's Orange Lauk, which is probably one of the most progressive Lauks in New South Wales. Then we have Bathurst Lauk. So they were established in 1984. They only have 4 staff, plus they use some casuals, so they have a really small team. They do all sorts of things. They maintain rental housing, they do social service programs, so they manage a place called the Barracks, which is like a men's hostel. They do education, they do a lot. They're basically spread super thin in Bathurst. And their main property, which they're most proud of, is Walu Gamara. And they were very proud that Uncle Warwick Peckham had spent 8 years in court fighting for this. So it's a piece of land on top of what is known as Mount Panorama that they're trying to get recognised as Mount Walu. And it's a really important site up there. They've slowly brought it back from being a degraded site. And it's super important, not just the cultural connection, but also because the white wallaroo, which is highly endangered, is also found on that site. So this is the site, and I just want to read you what's on this sign because it's quite a powerful message. So Walu Gamara means sacred awakening, and on this sign it says, acknowledgement of Wiradjuri custodians. Wiradjuri is the sky, the water, the earth, the trees and animals. It is everything you see, look after and respect. Sorry, it is everything you see. Look after and respect Wiradjuri country and our country will look after you. And that's in response to a bit of a history of not having their country looked after or respected. So in this quote, as history goes, the Bora stones were removed when obviously European settlement was happening, and those stones were used to build a hut up there. And now it's sort of quarantined off from the public, but it holds that significance for the Aboriginal community. It's a very spiritual place because of the elevation. It was deemed to be close to the spirits. So the Bathurst Lark also play a really active role in managing Windradine's grave, as Liz mentioned before. And they have that, I know most of you probably know that 180-year connection now it is with the farmers that have owned that land over all those generations. With the original farmers offering it as a place for Windradine and his men to camp on, and and they spoke Wiradjuri as well. So that relationship continues today. And they manage the land on there, but they also have a lot of educational trips to there. And this is just a quote about that. So it's good to have Dave, the farmer, speak from a sort of European point of view and his history with Windradine. And then, of course, you've got the cultural side too. So it's pretty interesting. And I think that the schools do get a lot out of it, which is sort of our main thing about educating youth in culture. So their aspirations were to have a cultural centre and have cultural tourism on Mount Walu. They wanted to be able to produce bush tucker, bush medicine and reinvigorate tool making up there. They wanted to learn how to use cultural burns to control pests and weeds. But a big thing for the Bathurst group was the better local acknowledgement of the history of violence in the area, and especially massacre sites like Bells Falls. And they wanted to be able to have more opportunities to cleanse certain sites, especially those on private lands. So they wanted to be able to foster better relationships with private landowners to do that. And this is just a quote from the CEO, reaching out for community people that lived on properties with regard to knowledge of any artefacts that they might have come across, that they might know about, because there was still conflicted ideology about Commonwealth law and Mabo and land being taken if anything was found. So it was my job to sort of dispel that and get some of the landholders back on board, but it was slow and arduous. I didn't have a good response, so I think it's a thing that has to be continual, not just a one-off program, because you can't engage people. There could have been more done to encourage others. So this was a really big aspiration of Bathurst Lark to create those relationships. Some of the barriers, of course, limited funding, capacity and time. They were saying that Mount Walu is taking up most of their time. Just being able to do weed management and keep it managed was taking up a lot of their resources too. Another big hurdle that they faced was finding someone who was good at grant writing to put in for funding. And in this quote, that applies to everything. If you want to branch out, you need someone proficient in grant writing, and that has to be their job and their only job. They also wanted more resources to be able to manage those weeds, so they don't just have Mount Walu, they have 3 other sites that they're actively trying to manage as well. And you can imagine with 4 staff and casuals every now and again when there's bits of funding, as well as everything else they're doing, it's quite hard to just keep up, let alone look for new opportunities. And there was also a little bit of discussion about people that weren't part of the Lauk claiming cultural sites and then restricting access. So there was some division in the local community there. So moving on to Mudgee Lauk, how much time do I have? Oh, I'm doing fine. So this is just a picture of the chairwoman, Alicia. So they had a group in 1995, but the Lauk was only established in 2003, so it's one of the newer Lauks, the younger Lauks. They have 72 members, but at the moment they only have 1 paid staff member. So Alicia there isn't paid by the Lauk. She mixes her other job in with working at the Lauk at the same time. And their main income is through heritage consultancy work for developers and mines. And their main property is Munna Reserve. And they have an interesting story about that. But basically, to be able to do certain things that they wanted to do on that property, after fighting for native title for years, they then had to spend $20,000 over 5 years to then extinguish that native title in order to be able to put in power lines and an easement. So they discussed some of those issues with different types of land tenure and what they are and aren't allowed to do as being a big barrier. And I just thought I'd put there that, you know, this is just an example of one of the Lauk's land claims. Basically, there's 362 in the Mudgee area that have been lodged. Only 2 have been granted, 18 have been refused, 10 have been finalised but not granted, and there's 332 that are incomplete. So a lot of time and effort is also spent on keeping up momentum with land claims, which takes resources and time, especially when you're relying on volunteers. I thought I'd just put this in as well because the Lauk took us to this special area. So these are just 2 trees that you can see there, just stumps really. But there were 6 in a semicircle, and they said that it used to be a sacred men's site and it's now a public park. And there's some scarring on the trees you can see. And this was quite a special place for the Lauk. They were, you know, because we asked the question, like, why isn't there any signage up saying that this is, you know, of such significance? And this is an issue with all the Lauks, that they want signage so that it's out there, like this is a cultural artefact, but at the same time, they all talked about the fact that as soon as you put up a sign, you're inviting vandalism via racism, basically, which has happened on other sites. So it's a bit of a catch-22 with recognising sites, but at the same time, not having the resources to protect them. So some of their aspirations were to have a cultural camp for kids on their properties, to also potentially set up a cultural burning service. They were really concerned about safeguarding a threatened cultural site known as the Drip. And they were really passionate about trying to connect up songlines and corridors across a highly fragmented landscape. Just a quote here, so you've got all these different groups. You've got your women's site, your men's site, you've got your communal site, you've got your artwork, you've got sensitive areas, you've got bora grounds, and all this is happening around this area and beyond. And all these sites are connected to each other spiritually and culturally. So you take away a part of that and the integrity is gone. So they were talking about trying to reconnect up sacred sites so that there was continuity across the landscape. Sorry. So some of the barriers they're facing, again, so lack of information on grants and clear avenues for funding, losing key contacts in organisations, again, people that they've built trust with that were then out of their jobs. Another one that is similar to what Bathurst was facing, but non-Mudgee Lauk people signing off on cultural assessments for developers. They're not being treated like the peak body. And this is a quote to illustrate that. So Mudgee's in a black hole, and because we're not seen as a big obvious community like Dubbo or Orange, you kind of get left out of everything. So the final group, the one that's a subgroup of Bathurst, is the Mingan Wiradjuri Aboriginal Corporation. So they had a predecessor group for Aboriginal housing, and they only established their own group in 2008. They're all volunteers, so all their time is volunteer time. And their main site is Mayingu Maragu, and there are paintings there that are over 30,000 years old that they're trying to look after. And when we asked, so why did you develop this group? This was one of the quotes. Well, it was the community presence, the presence of an Aboriginal community in this town, because otherwise it would have just gone on. We don't have black fellas living here, and we've been living here all our bloody life. And this is just a recent ceremony at that special site that they co-manage with the council. And this is the local Aboriginal Land Council helped put in this infrastructure so that there was finally a sign and some information saying that it was a culturally significant site. Before that, it was always known as a quite derogatory term, Blackfellow's Hand. And while that name still sticks on the sign, it is definitely in brackets below the proper name for that place. Oh, and this is just an image of one of the sites that they're protecting there, which is an axe grinding site. So they have lots of different art and heritage sites that they're protecting on that property, and many others around Lithgow area. So their aspirations were to have one of their properties federally recognised as an Aboriginal area so that they would have access to a ranger program so that they could get paid people in to look after their sites more regularly. They also wanted to be able to establish a cultural centre to have cultural tourism, education, ranger training. So they wanted basically paid positions and training capacity building. And they also talked of the need for repatriation of artefacts, specifically a platypus that Charles Darwin took back to England. They were quite passionate about trying to get that back. They really wanted to become self-sufficient. And just a quote, in the end, once their funding's there and everyone is able to go through everything, there's no reason that why in 5 to 8 years that the community couldn't be self-sufficient. So some of their barriers, so obviously a lack of paid positions at all, was hard, and they did have one of their members had a key position in the National Parks and Wildlife Services, but that position's since been made redundant. So that was a key part of their capacity and their connection to resources. So they're in desperate need now of having some sort of connection. A lack of time for grant writing. Some splinter groups and factions also claiming ownership over sites. They really were very passionate about trying to get Aboriginal knowledge being valued and respected locally, because that site where they had the sign up, it was constantly being trashed. And the local land services had recently helped them put in bollards and fencing to try and protect at least the sites where, you know, this 30,000-year-old artwork is, and the axe grinding sites. So, and they also wanted better relations with local institutions to be able to protect sites. So this is a quote, they've just gone and broken every taboo, every bloody cultural rule in the book, they've broke it. They got boulders from a men's site out at Oberon quarries and dumped it all around the reserve, and these are women's areas. They've totally destroyed the site. You just don't go to these places to stop being heartbroken all the time. It's like, oh God, I'm not even going there anymore. So to move on to engagement with LLS programs, which I'm going to go through pretty quickly, but the most successful program that the LLS was running was the cultural burning program, where they'd sent members from most of these lauks, but most predominantly Orange Lauk, up to Cape York to relearn practices. the practice of cool burning, basically. So here's a quote, and then we did have 2 people that went up to do the cultural burning in Cape York. That was actually practically applied, so you're out there for that, and your grandkids were out there, and it was good because we did burning. They were so motivated. We raked it around, so we had control of it. That was really something positive. We're only learning 2, and we're relearning cultural burning. And thanks to the LLS, the land councils had the opportunity to be taught that and bring that back. These things were unfortunately lost to us. We're having to relearn again. And for the Orange Lauk, having that big group of people go up and learn it, this is an elder saying it's almost like they found out what it was like, find out what it is to be black. Instead of looking for identity, you're sort of providing one for them through practice. And the Old Lauk has been involved from the outset of the project. They've gone to 2 of the different trips up to Cape York. And basically now their team is being contracted to do those cultural burns. So they've done 4 different burns on different private landholders' lands in the area, but getting that up to a certain point where council is using that service, and not just 4 private landholders, but many private landholders are using cultural burn services was their aim. And that was all initiated through the LLS. There was also funding through the LLS for protection of Aboriginal places, for pest and weed management, and biodiversity assessments and regeneration. The only one I'll touch on here is the fact that they're helping bring back the purple copper butterfly on Mount Walu. And it's very specific to Mount Walu because it lives on one plant. And this is just a quote from Bathurst. So the amazing thing is this butterfly was unknown to Western science until 30 years ago, but there's this dreaming story about how this butterfly goes underground, and the whole thing has to do with this relationship with ants, this specific type of ant, as well as this specific type of plant. And all the scientists had to do was come and talk to the local people, and they might have found that new species instead of looking at dead things in a museum. And now it only exists at 30 sites. So just to summarise really quickly, so there's lots of challenges that Lauks are facing. So loss of key people, with government changes, that's what that first quote is about. Different government changes have broken down programs that were really starting to work. The challenges are also not having a sense of ownership and control over cultural heritage, different rules, dealing with different rules for different types of land tenure, having competitors competing for access to cultural heritage sites, and being able to access sites on private lands, preservation and awareness of Aboriginal places to avoid them being trashed or threatened by development. A big one was finding dollars for cultural centres, because there are currently no cultural centres that any of these Lauks have, but they all want one. Unresolved land claims and the time and dollars put towards them. A lack of long-term resources, which means there's a lack of organisational stability, and because people are trying to just keep up with the amount of different things they're doing, there's a lack of strategic planning that goes along with that. Dealing with disconnected and fragmented landscapes. The barriers are basically lack of staff, lack of resources, lack of funding, lack of training. They really, really wanted to become self-reliant. Every single Lauk was like, we own land, we can produce something surely, and we can become self-reliant at some point. But there were no big enough grants out there to help. There was no avenue for that yet. There was a lack of infrastructure on their main sites, a lack of skilled workers, and lack of coordination amongst agencies interacting with Lauks as well. So the opportunities are many. I just summarised a few. Basically, each of the Lauks that we visited, so in the literature, when it comes to Lauks, a lot says that there's a lack of youth engaging in Lauks and having a succession plan in Lauks. But in each of these Lauks, they were characterised by the involvement of elders, and there was a key younger person with a really strong passion, a really high capacity, and an ability to articulate barriers, and they had a clear vision for the future, and that's something that we really found in each of these areas. So supporting those people in paid positions was really a key thing that could happen to stabilise these groups. There are also really strong lateral networks and really, really good opportunities for income generation. Basically, we had a bunch of recommendations for the LLS, but they were all around continuing the cultural burning program, continuing most of their engagement, but also acting as an advocacy group for other local institutions that LAUCs were dealing with, and to try and get cultural burning as a practice that should be mandatory for at least, local government and other local agencies should be using that in their land management along the side of the roads, like along the travelling stock routes and all that sort of thing. So I'll leave it there, but that was basically the project. So I'll hand back over to Peter now.
So I guess where does that experience that Beck and I and our colleagues had in talking with those local groups was incredibly enlightening experience. Just the amount of desire and passion for those people to actually try and protect and maintain the sites that they were aware of, the frustration of the multiple different government agencies that they had to deal with, and different sets of legislation, different sets of legal components to it, and the lack of resources. And I guess these are groups that are, if you like, at the forefront of a reconnection to country in a New South Wales kind of context. So what I'd like to do is sort of broaden out again now. I'm sure all of you are aware of the Uluru Statement from the Heart that happened last year, and the subsequent, dismissal of it at the federal level. But there's an ongoing movement for that, the key principles of that, which is the makarrata, the truth-telling, and then also the representative body that sits alongside Parliament. Interestingly about that Uluru Statement is that it's a critical component of that is that the fact that land has been lost and connection to land has been lost, and that the extent to which that connection to land can be continued is a critical thing for the health of those communities and for a meaningful future for people, young people that identify as Indigenous. So, I guess that's if you haven't already looked at it, have a look at it. Join the movement towards getting that Uluru Statement being considered strongly and by all stages of government. But I guess that brings us back to our little group. We're sort of at an interesting point because we started our work as part of the Faculty of Agriculture. We're now part of, from a teaching perspective, the School of Life and Environmental Sciences, which is within the Faculty of Agriculture, Faculty of Science. And we're also part of the Sydney Institute of Agriculture, which has a development agriculture focus and a community focus. So there's a number of different avenues for us as a group to work. But just to give you a summary of what we're trying to do, which is closely linked to the land aspect, I guess in the Faculty of Science, there are a number of different areas in which Indigenous science could be incorporated. But I guess the biggest, the area of connection to land is probably the strongest of those at this stage. And so we're really keen to get support both from within the science faculty and from Indigenous Strategies and Services to continue and consolidate the work that we're doing. And I guess the key components of that are the reviewing and inclusion of Indigenous content in education and research. And we've already done a lot of this, but then of course the whole structure of degrees and everything has changed in the last couple of years. So we've got to redo that. We've been continually gathering resources on Indigenous land management and knowledge of land and food to include in the curriculum and knowledge. We've developed a unit of study, the Indigenous land and food knowledge, where we take students up to the Northern Territory and Northern WA to visit a number of different Indigenous communities, look at enterprises on country and the challenges that are faced by those communities which have a greater level of continuity on their country and a larger area of land that's under some land tenure, but still the difficulties of those groups actually achieving what they're hoping to achieve through that. We've also got a field site communities project which is focused on the areas where the University of Sydney has land and is active in managing that land and doing research on that land. So we want to engage with the traditional owners of those areas and the Indigenous communities in those areas and try and get synergies of activities that flow from that. And one of the successes from that project is up in Narrabri, where the university has a wheat research institute, and we've recently purchased properties neighbouring that, where we're looking at a grasses for grain project, which I'll talk about a little more, and also a native food park where we're establishing a grassland and having a whole range of different native food plants as a part of that, and looking at that as a way of looking at the way land can be managed in that area. So there's some of the activities we're talking about, and I guess what we're basing that around is the working knowledge concept, which was well described in this particular paper. And so essentially what we're saying is that there's a lot of traditional knowledge that exists in areas, Indigenous knowledge that exists in areas. That knowledge would traditionally have been shared amongst people in the same group, but also people in neighbouring groups. And it was the coming together of all the elders that held components of that knowledge in ceremonies that brought that knowledge together. And so bringing that knowledge together in a contemporary sense becomes much more difficult because of the fragmentation of those communities. But Indigenous knowledge is still existing, and what we want to try and understand and tap into is that Indigenous knowledge, but for Indigenous people to bring it to a safe working space in the middle. And so there's a lot of local knowledge, there's pastoral and farming knowledge, there's scientific knowledge that can all be incorporated with Indigenous knowledge to understand better how to manage land and how to bring Indigenous people back to connection with country alongside Europeans that are living in the same landscape. And I guess one of the key things for this is a community of practice that Beck and I have been working with for a number of years. And so this community of practice is all about regenerating grasslands. And as we've already heard, grasslands are a major component of most of Australia. And so these people are actually using their domestic stock to regenerate landscapes. And they do this, regenerate grasslands. And they do this through, instead of animals spread all over the landscape, they hold their animals in one big mob. They have lots of paddocks, they move their animals from one place to another as they go forward. They rest the paddock for many, many months before grazing it again. So they know what's ahead of their animals, so they can better predict when they're going to run out of food. And so in our current environment with the drought and all of these people who've got lots of animals on their landscape and no feed to give them, these eco-innovators don't get in that situation. They have destocked long before they've lost all their feed. They adjust the number of animals long before they run out of feed, and as a result of that, they get a grassland which covers the land all of the time, and there's a new and emerging technology of actually sowing a crop directly into that grassland, have that crop come to maturity, and when the crop is harvested, the grassland comes back. And so this is a community of farmers that Beck and I have worked closely with, and we're bringing together with Indigenous knowledge of grasslands and so on in what we're calling the Grasses for Grain project. So we're linking that community of practice with local Indigenous people, establish a native food park where we're putting those ideas into practice, identify hotspots of Indigenous use of grasses for grain, and collect ecotypes of suitable species, undertake selection and plant breeding with an aim to produce perennial grain crops, and methods of harvest of native seed. Our innovators are already harvesting native seed and selling it at very high prices. So it's an alternative source of income for people who do this. And we're also we've got a number of students working on projects looking at the nutritional properties of native grass seeds as well. So this is some of the work that we're trying to do that's trying to bring those different knowledges together, trying to connect with people with the Indigenous knowledge of use of grain and turn it into something that will improve our agriculture. So the other thing that we can tell you about briefly is our unit of study. So we do invite members of staff every year to come along with us. It was always designed as a unit of study both for cultural competence for students and for staff. And so we're looking for staff every year who will join us. We take from 14 to 18 students each year, and as many staff as want to come and that we can fit in. And we travel around. And so essentially the objective of this is to expose students and staff to the realities of working with Indigenous communities in a place where those communities are doing a number of different things. It's embryonic in other parts of Australia, but we're wanting to move that on to other parts of Australia as we go through the years of running the course. So that gives you a bit of an idea of about that. Keep in touch with us if you're interested in being part of that unit. So just very quickly, we cover time in Darwin, where we interact with the groups there, the Larrakia Nation. This is us. This is the Larrakia with a range of different people. We get introduced to country, we get welcomed to country by people, we get an overview of what's happening within those communities. We go out to an Indigenous-owned cattle station near Litchfield and Twin Hills. We look through the various both tourist and non-tourist components of that. We continue on. June Mills has talked to us in Darwin. We've worked with the Kenby Rangers who are doing work on country. We get talks from CDU, Charles Darwin Uni people that are working closely in this area. In Katherine, we've been visiting a tomato farm for many years, helping them with what they're doing. The students produce a feasibility study to help an Indigenous community enhance an existing enterprise or a feasibility study for an additional enterprise. And we've also in Katherine, working with a number of different communities, going through the Katherine Gorge, looking at the range of connection to country that we see there, and then looking at the Indigenous Pastoral Program and Indigenous Women's Association, which is set up with the help of Food Ladder, which is an NGO producing food for local communities. And then we work with a particular elder, Bill Harney, who is a famous artist and an elder in that area. The students meet him, they get to visit his country. We go to Kununurra then, which is where the Ord River irrigation scheme is, which is another story in itself. We hear a lot about Australia developing the north. We have only one really example of a large irrigation development in the north, which was put in the 1970s and which has struggled all that time. It was put in before any Aboriginal land rights, and they had to retrospectively provide Aboriginal land rights over that irrigation scheme. So there's a whole range of stuff that happens there. We engage with the Miramar Indigenous Language Group. We engage with the Molly Springs Group, which is a subgroup of that. We've had Welcome to Country at Molly Springs. And in Kununurra, we also look at what's happening in terms of agricultural development there, what that means in terms of northern development, what the Ord River scheme looks like, and where the future might be for that Ord River scheme. So that just gives you a bit of a taster. And this is our scheme for the ongoing development. So we're in year 3 of this program. What we're hoping to be able to do in the next 2 or 3 years is branch into other areas such as Western New South Wales, where we could continue this program in Western New South Wales rather than going all the way to the Northern Territory. But that gives you a bit of an idea of the sort of work we're at and that we're looking for people. And acknowledge the work that Beck's done on that, and also Matt Pye, who's going to be taking over the running of that unit from this year onwards. So that's basically all we've got to talk to you about. We'd like to spend a bit of time now, we've got lunch there, but we want to spend a bit of time in forum. So a question and answer session. Liz and Beck and I will come up to the top. Liz is going to facilitate the discussion, and so that we've got an opportunity for people to ask questions about any of the things we've talked about so far, or offer ideas, suggestions about the future and where we might work from here. So I'll hand over to Liz.
Yes, so we've got Kathy with the roving mic for questions. I guess I'll start with one if that will get us going. And I guess it's for you, Beck. So some of your focus groups revealed that an issue for a few of them was not the appropriate people signing off on cultural assessments for development. Who is signing those off if it's not the community?
I guess they're community members that aren't endorsed by the LALC. So they are still community members. I guess, I mean, without going too much into it, there's, you know, competing land claims between different elders that probably both have rights. So there's all sorts of competition through the legislation that's being set up. It develops this competition on the ground.
Excuse me.
Yeah?
It's rather difficult to hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Across the room.
Sorry.
Down the room.
Yes, I know, I'm sorry.
The sound isn't the best, so thank you very much.
Sorry, I forgot how big a space this is. I was just saying that they're usually people that are putting in assessments that aren't endorsed by the LALC. Are signing off assessments or putting in claims that aren't endorsed by the LALC. They are still local community people, but the way the legislation is set up is that people can compete. So there are different elder groups in some areas, and different factions and different families that control different areas. And that's proving to be a problem for something like the LALC, which is meant to be the peak body and gets the funding, is meant to be looking after areas. So I think it's very complicated and complex. In each area it plays out a bit differently, but yeah.
Any other questions?
Has it ever occurred to the powers that be that it might be an idea to send a few Aboriginal people, as has been done, I think, around Orange, after the bushfires that we have every 10 years, to be employed to go into the national parks and wildlife areas and do strategic burning, rather than just let the undergrowth build up and we get a huge fire and disaster?
I guess that's the hope going forward, that National Parks and Wildlife Services will get on board. Some local National Parks and Wildlife officers have been getting people to come in and do cultural burns, but it's not a required thing across National Parks and Wildlife Services yet. So trying to get it to a point where, so that Orange has that, team set up, and that all government agencies have to use that type of burning. That's really one of their main aspirations, to get to that point. Just being able to work with local council and being able to manage sites that local council have, like reserves and everything, that's still not mandated yet. So yeah, but that is what they want to do, and effectively try and reduce those massive burns that devastate New South Wales and Victoria. So.
I can talk a bit about that too. Yeah, it's a bit of a contested space, the whole burning thing, right? Obviously, it's a hugely emotive issue, trying to manage a landscape which is prone to burning, as ours is, and that's only getting worse with our. Currently we've got fires burning in August, which was unprecedented before. And this is not just happening in Australia, it's happening all over the world. Areas that weren't burning at a certain time are now burning. And so really, you've got a lot of competing interests in terms of the way lands are managed. There's a lot of controversy about hazard reduction burns, both from a biodiversity perspective. If they're done very badly, they can have a massive impact on biodiversity. If they're done very well, there's a very small window of times when they can be done. And then if you add the complication of an Indigenous component to that, and there's a science around burning as well, this becomes a very contested space. So I don't think in the short term there's going to be any clarity really about what sort of burning is going to happen and when and how. And that's always going to be very fraught.
Can I add something else?
Yep.
So like they're only just are the Rural Fire Service starting to engage with the louts to look at cool burning. And in Orange, I know last year, when the RFS was doing some of their hazard reduction burns, they tried to do some cool burns at the same time. And then they took photos of both the sites, you know, one site, no canopy left, cool burn site, canopy left, and presented them to the RFS to try and say, the way you're burning is harming the land, and here's another solution. But there's a lot of pushback to that as well. So yeah, it is, yeah.
Hi, I did actually have another question about the cultural burning. So you said that some members of the Louts were taken up to Cape York to learn about some of the cultural burning practices that have been going on there. Is there a big difference in how cultural burning would have taken place due to the difference in the environment between a place like Cape York, which I imagine is quite different to central New South Wales? And so can you take those practices and just bring them straight down? Do you have to make adaptations for them? Is there some knowledge that's just been totally lost?
Yeah, good question. In fact, one of the members of our team, Milton Lewis, was a local land services employee who also spent 2 years learning burning in Cape York. That's really the only place where burning is still practiced according to its traditional way, or pretty much the only place. Most of the other places it's not possible, obviously, and so within most areas of New South Wales there aren't really any elders that have got a broad range of the knowledges. But what tends to happen, and Milton describes this when he gets a group of Indigenous people that are local to an area in New South Wales and talks to them about the principles of burning, there's bits of knowledge that come back to them about that. And so mostly the principles are that the burn is done at a time of year when it's going to be quite a cool burn. So Aboriginal people do burning with bare feet. The burn is not very hot, so it doesn't fry the ground. It also doesn't go into the canopy of the trees. So all it does essentially is remove some of the litter at the base, and not all of the litter even. And so it's a very different approach to a rural fire service hazard reduction burn, which is also done in a cool part of the year, but often done when the winds aren't right, or it's done at a much more violent way, and so there's a lot more impact of that burn that happens rather than it done in a very cool, gentle way in the right sort of environment.
But yeah, they all talk about it. They all talk about it just trickling along the ground, and then you just put down a bit more fire and you watch that trickle along the ground, and animals can get away. It's not, and it's a community practice, so you all walk through together doing little trickles and following the trickles. Yeah. So it's very different.
And so I think those principles are similar, but of course up there it's a savanna landscape, which is, very wet for a period of the year, and then then it dries out, and you've got a massive amount of dry material. And so there it's even more critical, because clearly that massive growth becomes very dry, and so it's very critical there. And I'm sure you know that up in the north there are rangers groups that are being paid for the carbon saved through Indigenous burning rather than a hot burn that might happen later in the season. And so they avoid greenhouse gas emissions through doing traditional burning rather than an accidental burn that happens once the landscape's fully dried out. And so that's a well-recognised program now in the Northern Territory, and in our trip we hear about that and learn from rangers that are involved in that. So that's a really interesting, modern adaptation of a traditional practice that's got a beneficial and an economic basis. Yep.
sure Peter and Beck will be around for lunch, so if you had any other questions or comments or discussions that you'd like to have with them, I'm sure they'd be very welcome for you to do that. So I guess the thing that's left for me is to thank both of our wonderful speakers, and if you could join me in doing that.